My name is Cora Whitfield. I'm 28 years old. 3 days after my firefighter husband died running back into a burning warehouse, my parents walked into my hospital room. My newborn son, 4 pounds, still on oxygen, was lying in the bassinet beside me. My father looked at us and said coldly, "You're discharged. Take the bastard and go back to his family. Widows aren't our responsibility." My mother nodded and added, "We've already done enough for you. Don't drag us down with your bad luck." I held my son tighter and said nothing. They didn't know I had made one phone call an hour earlier. They didn't know the man who just walked through the door, with 2 uniformed officers behind him, was about to make my father's hands shake so violently he dropped the discharge papers. And they definitely didn't know that everything they had just said would be the last words they ever spoke to me as their daughter. The sterile air of the recovery wing at Charleston Memorial Hospital was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol and cheap cafeteria coffee, a stark contrast to the heavy, lingering smell of soot that had settled into Cora's very pores over the last 72 hours. Her fingers, pale and trembling slightly, traced the edge of the blue and pink receiving blanket wrapped around her tiny son. He was so incredibly small, 4 pounds and 2 ounces of fragile, fighting life, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow movements under the soft plastic of the nasal cannula. Beside the bed, the steady rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the neonatal monitor was the only anchor keeping Cora grounded in a world that had completely tilted on its axis. Just 3 days ago, her husband Ethan, a man whose laughter could fill a room and whose presence always felt like a warm, protective shield, had walked out their front door in his heavy turnout gear. He had kissed her forehead, then bent down to press his lips against her swollen belly. "Home by 5, Cora Belle," he had whispered, his eyes crinkling with that familiar, boyish mischief. He hadn't made it home. Now the door to room 412 clicked open. Cora didn't look up immediately, expecting the soft, squeaking rubber soles of Nurse Wren, her longtime colleague and friend, who had kept a quiet, vigilant watch over her during the long, agonizing labor. But the footsteps that crossed the threshold were different. They were firm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the gentle hesitation that usually accompanied visitors entering a room of mourning. It was her father, Douglas Lockridge. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, every crease pressed to perfection, looking more like he was stepping into a corporate boardroom than a hospital room where his daughter had just delivered a premature child under the shadow of tragedy. In his right hand he carried a thick, stiff manila folder. In his left, a stapled packet of paper he had snatched from the unit's front desk. Behind him followed her mother, Marlene, her face carefully composed, holding a plastic drugstore bag containing a package of standard newborn diapers. Marlene didn't look at the baby. She looked at the floor, then at the IV pole, then finally at Cora. Her mouth twitched into a tight, superficial line that she used whenever she had to navigate an unpleasant social situation. "You're discharged," Douglas said, his voice flat, cutting through the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator like a scalpel. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't ask how she was feeling, or if her body, exhausted and healing from an emergency delivery, was in pain. He simply stepped up to the bedside table and tossed the stapled papers onto the tray with a dry paper slap. "Take the bastard and go back to his family," Douglas continued, his eyes briefly flicking toward the bassinet with an unmistakable flash of disdain. "Beverly is here in the city. She has the space, and she has the resources of that firefighter pension. Widows aren't our responsibility, Cora." Marlene stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She placed the drugstore bag on the visitor's chair, avoiding the bassinet entirely. "We've already done enough for you, sweetheart. We paid for that nursing degree. We tolerated that clannish lifestyle you married into. Don't drag us down with your bad luck now. Your brother Trenton is going through an incredibly difficult financial transition, and your father needs to focus his energy on keeping our own family afloat." Cora's hand instinctively tightened over the cotton of her gown, her palm resting over her son's tiny chest. She felt the rapid flutter of his heart. It was a beautiful, stubborn rhythm. She looked up at her parents, her expression entirely unreadable. Her eyes, usually so expressive, were as cold and still as deep harbor water. "Okay," she said softly. Douglas's shoulders dropped slightly, a subtle physical release of tension that Cora recognized instantly. He had expected a fight. He had expected tears, pleading, or a dramatic breakdown. When none of those came, he immediately shifted back into his natural element, the smooth, efficient closer. "Good," Douglas nodded, reaching into his breast pocket to extract a heavy gold-plated pen. He opened the manila folder on the bed tray, turning it to face her. "We just need a few signatures to get things sorted. This is the MetLife Group Term Life Beneficiary Change Request Form. If we get this process today, the payout will bypass the standard probate delays. I'll take care of the administrative side, handle the payouts, and make sure a portion is allocated to help you get settled over at Beverly's place in Savannah." Cora stared at the document. Right there, on the surviving spouse signature line, was her name, Cora Whitfield. But as her eyes traced the ink, a cold electric shock ran down her spine. The signature was already there. It was written in a dark blue ink, a nearly perfect replica of her handwriting. But the letter C in Cora opened with a distinct, sharp downstroke. Cora's breath hitched in her throat, though she kept her face completely frozen. When she was 12 years old, her father had sat her down at his massive mahogany desk in their Mount Pleasant home, surrounded by ledger books and blank corporate checks. He had pointed to her messy, childish script and said, "Corabelle, always use the upstroke on your capital C. It's a banker's mark. It shows precision. It makes it harder for anyone to copy." She had signed her name with that precise upstroke for 16 years. On her nursing license, her apartment leases, her marriage certificate. Her father had remembered the lesson he taught her, but in his haste to forge her name while she lay anesthetized on the 6th floor, he had forgotten his own rule. He had written it with a downstroke. "Can I have a few minutes?" Cora asked, her voice steady, almost polite. "I want to hold him for a moment before we start signing federal insurance waivers. The nurse said I only have a short window before he has to go back down to the progressive nursery." Douglas frowned, his jaw tightening as he glanced at his watch. "Cora, we don't have all day. The brokers in Charleston need these files scanned before the close of business." "10 minutes, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, quieter register that carried an unexpected weight. "Just 10 minutes." Marlene touched Douglas's arm, giving him a quick, warning look. "Let her have her moment, Douglas. It's delicate." Douglas sighed, snapping his pen shut. "Fine. 10 minutes. We'll be right outside in the corridor." The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, Cora reached for her phone on the bedside table. Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up her messages. She didn't call the police. She didn't call her brother. She typed a single message to Bishop Howard, Ethan's godfather, his father's old partner, and the battalion chief who had stood by her side since the moment the black department SUV had pulled into her driveway 3 days ago. They came. They brought the MetLife papers. Dad called the baby a bastard. "My name is already signed with a downstroke. Please come now. Bring whoever you need." She hit send. Then she leaned back against the thin hospital pillows, closed her eyes, and listened to the steady, unbothered beep of her son's monitor, waiting for the storm to arrive. The silence that settled over room 412 after the door closed was heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. For the first time in 3 days, Cora felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. She looked down at little Bishop Jr., whose tiny fingers twitched against the hospital blanket. "They don't know who you are," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the oxygen machine. "But they are about to find out." She did not let her mind wander to the grief of losing Ethan. Not yet. She needed to compartmentalize, a skill she had perfected during long nights in the labor and delivery ward, when a monitor started dropping and every second counted. She carefully picked up her phone and checked the status of her message. Bishop Howard had read it. Exactly 4 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a simple 3-word reply. On my way. Cora sat back, her heart hammering a steady, fierce rhythm against her ribs. She looked at the manila folder on the bed tray. She reached out and pulled it closer, her fingers tracing the textured paper. Slowly, deliberately, she opened it. The documents inside were meticulous. Her father had always been a master of administrative theater. Underneath the forged MetLife beneficiary change request form lay a secondary document, a Public Safety Officer's Benefits PSOB, intent to file form. It was a federal claim, a program administered by the Department of Justice to provide financial assistance to the survivors of fallen first responders. At the bottom of that page, there it was again. Cora Whitfield signed with the precise, practiced downstroke of her father's hand. A quiet, bitter laugh escaped Cora's throat. Her father had always viewed people as portfolios. When she had married Ethan, he hadn't seen a young couple building a life. He had seen a firefighter's kid and a high-risk liability. He had tolerated the marriage because he believed their kind always finds fires. And now that the fire had finally claimed Ethan, Douglas was moving in to collect the ashes. She closed the folder just as the door handle rattled. Douglas and Marlene walked back into the room, followed by another set of footsteps. Cora's older brother, Trenton, stepped into the room. He was 33, dressed in a faded athletic polo and jeans, looking disheveled. In his hand, he clutched a small plastic bag containing a cheap stuffed teddy bear with the tag still attached, a performative gesture of unclehood that felt entirely hollow. Trenton's eyes were bloodshot, his fingernails chewed down to the pink, raw quick. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "Hey, sis," Trenton said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to offer a casual smile. He set the bag on the edge of the bed. "Just wanted to check in. Blair sends her love. She's on bed rest, otherwise she'd be here." "Thanks, Trenton," Cora said, her voice flat. Trenton shifted his weight, his eyes immediately darting to the manila folder on her bed tray. He swallowed hard. "So, Dad's helping you get the paperwork sorted? That's good. South Carolina probate can be an absolute nightmare if you don't get ahead of it." "Is that why you're here, Trenton?" Cora asked, looking him dead in the eye. "To help me navigate probate?" Trenton flinched, looking desperately toward his father. Douglas stepped in seamlessly, placing a heavy, commanding hand on Trenton's shoulder. "Your brother is just concerned, Cora. We all are. Now, let's get this signature taken care of so we can let you get some rest. I have the notary downstairs waiting to stamp the files." He picked up the gold-plated pen and pushed the folder toward her once more. Cora didn't take the pen. Instead, she leaned back and looked up at her father. "Dad, this MetLife form, it transfers the immediate survivor benefits directly into a secondary trust, doesn't it?" Douglas's eyes narrowed slightly, the professional warmth fading from his expression. "It's a standard sheltering trust, Cora. It protects the capital from immediate taxation and keeps it secure while you transition. Don't worry about the technicalities. That's what I'm here for." "But the secondary trustee listed is Trenton's estate," Cora said softly, her eyes holding his. The room went entirely silent. Marlene, standing near the window, began to nervously check her watch. Trenton looked at the floor, his jaw working as he tried to blink away the sheer panic in his eyes. "Cora, honey," Marlene spoke up, her voice high and strained as she attempted to shatter the tension. "Why don't we talk about something lighter? Your brother has had such a difficult month, but your father is helping him. Breathe again. Everything is going to smooth out for all of us soon." Breathe again. The words hit Cora like a physical blow. She knew what that meant. Trenton's gambling debts, the whispered conversations she had caught on the edges of family holidays. He had been sinking, and her father was using her dead husband's sacrifice as a lifeline to pull his golden boy out of the deep. Before Douglas could speak, the heavy wooden door of the hospital room was pushed open with a firm, solid force. The heavy, measured stride of department-issued boots echoed against the linoleum. Bishop Howard walked in first. He wasn't in his working Class B uniform. He was dressed in his full Class A chief's uniform, the gold trim gleaming, the ribbons of 33 years of service pinned proudly to his chest, and his battalion badge polished to a mirror shine. He looked like a monument of absolute, unyielding authority. Behind him stepped Officer Grady Bannister of the Charleston Police Department, his badge visible on his chest. And behind Grady came Deputy Marsden Kellner of the Sheriff's Office, his tall frame filling the remaining space in the doorway. Douglas stood up instantly, his corporate composure fracturing in a fraction of a second. He saw the uniforms, he saw the grim, set expressions of the lawmen, and the discharge papers he was holding slid straight out of his trembling fingers, scattering across the floor like dead leaves. "Douglas," Bishop said, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with a quiet fury that made the hospital walls feel small. "I believe you have some paperwork that belongs to the federal government." The room shrank instantly. Douglas looked at the scattered white sheets of the hospital discharge papers resting on the polished floor tiles, then up at Bishop, his face draining of what little color it had left. Trenton stepped back so quickly his shoulder struck the wall, his hands raised slightly as if to ward off a blow. Marlene remained frozen by the window, her hand hovering over her mouth in a gesture of pure, silent shock. Bishop didn't spare them a second glance. He walked straight to the side of the bed, his heavy boots silent on the linoleum, and leaned down. The stiff wool of his Class A uniform brushed against Cora's shoulder as he pressed a gentle, paternal kiss to her forehead. "Cora Belle," he murmured, his voice softening just enough for her to hear. "I'm right here. Beverly just parked the car. She'll be up in a minute." When he stood back up to his full height, the gentleness vanished. He turned to face Douglas, the gold trim of his chief's sleeve caught in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Douglas Lockridge," Bishop said, his voice dropping into a register that was terrifyingly calm. "This is Officer Bannister with Charleston PD and Deputy Kellner with the County Sheriff's Office. They are here to conduct a welfare check on my godson and his mother, and to secure physical evidence of a suspected federal crime." "Welfare check?" Douglas scoffed, though his voice cracked on the first syllable. He tried to adjust his cuffs, a desperate reflex to regain his executive posture. "Bishop, this is a family matter. We are preparing our daughter for her discharge. I was merely expediting the administrative burden so she could focus on healing." "Expediting," Bishop repeated flatly. He stepped forward, pulling the heavy visitor chair up to the bed tray, and sat down. From the inside pocket of his dress coat, he pulled a plain manila envelope and laid it flat on the tray, right next to Douglas's thick folder. He didn't open it yet. He simply rested his large, calloused hand on top of it. "I want you to walk me through exactly what is in your folder, Douglas," Bishop said, his eyes locking onto the older man. "And just so we are all completely clear on the parameters of this conversation, Cora's phone is currently recording. South Carolina is a one-party consent state. Every single word spoken in this room is now on the record." Cora didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone from the mattress, opened the recording app, and tapped the screen. The tiny red light began to blink, capturing the heavy, ragged breathing of her father. "Cora, please," Douglas whispered, turning his gaze to her, his eyes wild with a mixture of betrayal and desperation. "I had your verbal authorization over the phone. I was only trying to protect you. You know how quickly these corporate policies can get tied up in probate if they aren't claimed immediately." "Dad," Cora said. Her voice was remarkably steady, carrying the quiet, absolute authority of a nurse who had spent years speaking over the chaos of emergency rooms. "I did not speak to you a single time between the phone call at 3:15, the afternoon Ethan died, and 10:15 this morning when you walked through that door. You told me you couldn't come because of paperwork. You left me alone for 68 hours, Dad. Not a phone call, not a text, nothing." Douglas's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His fingers began to twitch, then shake so violently that he had to press them against the edge of the bed tray to keep them still. Marlene reached out to touch his elbow, trying to anchor him, But Douglas violently jerked his arm away from her touch. It was the first time Cora had ever seen her parents reject each other's support in public. Bishop slowly unbuttoned the brass clasp of the manila envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the tray, positioning it directly under Douglas's face. "This is a simple timeline, Douglas," Bishop said, tapping the first line with his index finger. "All of this March 6, 2026, 11:14 a.m. Line of duty death confirmed. Firefighter Ethan Whitfield, Charleston FD Station 9. 5/9 March 7, 2026, 2:15 a.m. Bishop Ethan Whitfield, Jr., born premature at MUSC. Mother Cora Whitfield placed in post-anesthesia recovery until approximately 8 a.m. 9:00 4 a.m. Public Safety Officers Benefits. Intent to file claim electronically submitted under the name of Cora Whitfield, surviving spouse. Contact email listed. d@lockage@lockagebrokerage.com. Bishop leaned forward, his eyes burning into Douglas's face. Cora was legally incapacitated, under heavy anesthesia, and unable to sign so much as a water cup authorization until 8 that morning. Yet 3 hours later, a federal benefit claim worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was submitted in her name from an IP address registered to your home office. Explain to me, Douglas, how she signed that document." The room was so silent that the tiny rhythmic beep of little Bishop Jr.'s heart monitor seemed to echo off the walls like a hammer. No one moved. No one breathed. "Do you want to make a statement now?" Bishop asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Or would you like to wait until the Department of Justice asks the questions?" Trenton made a sharp, desperate move toward the door, his face slick with sweat, but Officer Bannister stepped into his path with a polite, heavy-set composure that brooked no argument. "Please stay in the room, sir," Bannister said, his voice flat but perfectly courteous. "This is just a conversation for now." Trenton sank back against the visitor's chair, burying his face in his hands. Bishop reached back into his envelope and pulled out a second document. He laid it flat on the tray next to the timeline. It was a copy of the federal PSOB claim submission page. At the bottom was a digital scan of Cora's signature, written in dark blue ink with a sharp, heavy downstroke starting the capital C. Beside it, Bishop placed a copy of Cora's actual hospital admission sheet, which she had signed by hand at 8:42 a.m. on March 7th, her signature displaying the distinct, elegant upstroke she had used since she was 12 years old. "Two signatures, same name, different hands," Bishop said, his voice dropping an octave. "Anyone with eyes can see it. But more importantly, Deputy Kellner has spent the last 48 hours with the Fraud Division at the Sheriff's Office, verifying the digital tracking on the submission." Deputy Kellner took a slow step forward, his thumbs tucked into his duty belt, his voice gentle and apologetic, carrying the thick, slow drawl of a seasoned local lawman. "Mr. Lockage, the Public Safety Officers Benefits Program is a federal program administered directly by the Department of Justice in Washington. Submitting a forged document to obtain those funds isn't just a local civil dispute. It's a federal felony, wire fraud, and making false statements to a federal agency. It's out of our hands. This file is being referred to the FBI's Charleston field office today, and you can expect a visit from their investigators within 72 hours. Douglas's eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged gasps. He wasn't thinking about the law, or his daughter, or his newborn grandson. Cora could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was picturing the whispers at the Mount Pleasant Yacht Club, the sudden silence when he walked into his brokerage firm, the slow, agonizing collapse of the status he had spent 30 years building on a foundation of clean paper and quiet lies. "There's more," Bishop said, pulling a third document from the envelope. This one was a printed email, dated March 7th at 8:14 p.m. Bishop didn't explain it, He simply read the text out loud, his voice flat and steady. Rowena, Doug is handling the paperwork situation with Cora's late husband's benefits. Once we get her back to the Whitfields, everything smooths out. Trenton will finally be able to breathe again. Please don't say anything to your sister. Love, M. Marlene gasped, her face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. She stared at the printout as if it were a venomous snake on the bed tray. How did you get that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Your cousin Rowena's daughter, Adeline, is married to a rookie firefighter in Station 4, Bishop said, his eyes drilling into Marlene. His lieutenant's wife is Officer Bannister's sister. Adeline saw this email on her mother's computer, thought the tone was cold and suspicious, given that Ethan had just died, and forwarded it to Beverly Whitfield on Sunday morning. Your family didn't protect you, Marlene. Your own family turned you in." Marlene sank slowly into the visitor's chair, her manicured fingers trembling as she stared at the floor. "You thought you were so clever, Douglas," Bishop said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "But Ethan knew exactly who you were. He spent 3 years watching how you looked at his uniform, how you talked about his family like they were nothing but bad luck waiting to happen, and he made sure his wife would never be at your mercy." Bishop reached into the manila envelope for the 4th time, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying the heavy solemnity of a ritual. He pulled out a black iPhone, Ethan's personal phone, recovered from his locker at Station 9, and returned to Cora only the night before. Bishop looked at Cora, his eyes asking a silent question. "Cora Bell, do I have your permission?" Cora nodded, her throat too tight to produce a sound. Bishop pressed his thumb to the screen, entering the passcode he had kept memorized for weeks. He opened the Voice Memos app and tapped the top entry, dated January 22nd, 2026, titled simply, "For Cora Bell _ 012226. He laid the phone flat on the bed tray, turning the speaker toward Douglas. The soft, familiar crackle of a truck's cabin came through the speaker, followed by the faint rustle of wind against a windshield. Then Ethan's voice filled the clinical chill of room 412. It was steady, warm, and so painfully alive that Cora felt her heart fracture all over again. "Cora Bell, if you're listening to this, it means something went wrong, and Bishop is with you. He's got the paperwork. He's got the trust. Your dad doesn't know. Don't let him convince you to sign anything. I love you. Take care of our boy." The recording cut to static and then silence. It was exactly 52 seconds long. In the bassinet, little Bishop Jr. let out a soft, tiny sigh and blinked his eyes open, his face turning instinctively toward the sound of his father's voice. Cora stared at him, her hand trembling against her gown. She would never ask if it was a coincidence. In her heart, she knew her son had recognized the beat of the voice that had sung to him through her skin for 8 months. No one in the room spoke. Officer Bannister stared resolutely at the floor, his jaw set, while Deputy Kellner quietly removed his tan sheriff's hat and held it against his chest. Marlene's shoulders began to shake, a quiet, pathetic weeping breaking through her stiff composure. Douglas sat frozen, staring at the phone as if it were a ghost. "Your son-in-law knew you were going to do this, Douglas," Bishop said, his voice dropping into a low, heavy rumble that filled the silence. "He knew your ledger book mind. He wrote it down, he recorded it, and he put everything into a legally binding trust with me, as the sole trustee weeks before he stepped into that warehouse. He protected his wife. And you, my God, Douglas, you walked into this room and called his son a bastard in front of an off-duty officer and 2 law enforcement officers." Bishop stood up slowly, the brass buttons of his Class A coat catching the light as he straightened the fabric with a firm tug. He looked down at Douglas with an expression that held no anger, only a deep, ancient disappointment. "Douglas, your grandson is going to grow up," Bishop said softly. "He is going to be strong, and he is going to be proud of his father's name. And one day, he is going to be told exactly what happened in this room. I want you to sit with that for the rest of your life." Deputy Kellner stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the linoleum as he picked up the thick manila folder and the scattered discharge papers from the floor. He placed them deliberately into a heavy plastic evidence bag, sealing the zip with a loud final click. "Mr. Lockridge, I don't have the jurisdiction to arrest you on a federal charge today," Kellner said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. "That will be the decision of the FBI's Charleston field office. But I am confiscating these documents as evidence. You will hear from the federal investigators within 72 hours. Do not attempt to contact MetLife. Do not contact the PSOB office. Do not attempt any further administrative filings regarding your son-in-law's estate. Do you understand?" Douglas's mouth twitched, his eyes fixed on the plastic bag containing his ruined plans. "I understand," he whispered, the words barely carrying enough air to escape his throat. Officer Bannister turned his gaze toward Marlene and Trenton. "The same instructions apply to both of you. Do not contact Cora Whitfield. Do not contact Beverly Whitfield. If you attempt to reach them, bypass them, or pressure them in any way, it will be treated as federal witness tampering. Do you understand?" Marlene nodded slowly, her hands still pressed against her trembling lips. Trenton merely stared at his shoes, his face pale and slick with sweat, and muttered, "Yes, officer." Marlene finally looked up at Cora, her eyes wet with tears that carried no real remorse, only the sudden, sharp panic of a woman watching her comfortable world disintegrate. "Cora, please," she stammered, taking a small, tentative step toward the bed. We thought we were helping. Your brother is in so much trouble, sweetheart. We just wanted—" "Mom," Cora interrupted. Her voice was remarkably calm, carrying no anger, no hatred, only an absolute, chilling finality. She didn't even turn her head to look at her mother. Her eyes remained fixed on the tiny, fragile face of her sleeping son. "You told me to take the baby and go back to his family. That is exactly what I'm doing." As if on cue, the heavy wooden door of room 412 pushed open once more. Beverly Whitfield walked in. She had driven through the heavy coastal rain all the way from Savannah, her linen coat damp at the shoulders. In her hand, she held a small, soft stuffed lamb she had bought at the airport gift shop. She stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the room. The scattered discharge papers, the police uniforms, the pale, defeated faces of the Lockridge family. She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't need one. She looked at Cora, then down at the tiny baby in the bassinet, and her face softened into an expression of fierce, protective maternal love. "Can I hold my grandson?" Beverly asked, her southern drawl thick, carrying the strength of iron wrapped in honey. Cora felt the last remnants of the heavy, suffocating silence lift from the room. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." Beverly stepped past the frozen, shattered remnants of the Lockridge family without offering them a single glance. She walked with a quiet, grounded grace, her damp linen coat smelling of the fresh April rain outside. When she reached the bassinet, she sat down slowly in the chair Marlene had just vacated, her eyes pooling with a warmth that seemed to push the last of the room's clinical chill into the corners. Slowly, tenderly, Beverly slipped her arms beneath the small, blanket-wrapped bundle. She gathered little Bishop Jr. against her chest, her hands steady and practiced. She didn't look at the nasal cannula or the wires running to the monitor. She only looked at his face. "Oh, my sweet boy," Beverly whispered, her voice a soothing, rhythmic hum. "You look just like your daddy did when they first brought him to me. You have his stubborn chin, yes you do. Underneath the gentle rasp of her Savannah drawl, there was an unspoken promise, a solid wall of protection that Cora felt settle over the room. Douglas, Marlene, and Trenton quietly retreated, slipping out of the door like shadows escaping the light. The door clicked shut behind them, and with that soft sound, the chapter of Cora's life as their daughter was closed forever. The rest of March passed in a blur of sterile routines, shifting monitors, and quiet victories. Little Bishop Jr. was a fighter. Day by day, his breathing grew stronger, his chest rising and falling with a steadier, deeper rhythm. By the end of the month, the doctors turned off the oxygen concentrator, and the soft nasal cannula was finally removed from his tiny nose. On April 2nd, the nursery scale tipped at exactly 5 pounds. 5 pounds of stubborn, beautiful life. 5 days later, on April 7th, the discharge papers were finally signed, this time with Cora's own hand, her signature sweeping upward with the proud, clean upstroke she would never hide again. When the sliding glass doors of the hospital lobby parted, the warm, humid air of a Charleston spring rushed to meet them. Bishop Howard's black F-150 was idling at the curb. Bishop himself stood by the passenger door, his Class A uniform replaced by his working Class B blues, his eyes crinkling with a quiet, relieved smile as he saw Cora holding the car seat. Beverly sat in the back seat, ready to watch over the baby for every mile of the journey. As Bishop pulled the truck into the flow of traffic, Cora looked out the window at the familiar streets of Charleston. They did not turn toward Ashley Avenue. They did not go back to the small, historic rental house where she and Ethan had spent 3 years building a life of shared dreams and half-unpacked boxes. While Cora had been recovering, Bishop and his wife, Delilah, had quietly gone to the house with Cora's written permission. Over 2 long afternoons, they had packed up the baby's nursery, Cora's clothes, the framed wedding photos from the mantel, and Ethan's dress uniform. They had even taken the small, polished wooden box from the top of Ethan's dresser, the one containing his most personal keepsakes. They had loaded everything into the bed of the truck and driven it down to Savannah in 2 quiet trips, leaving the rental clean and empty. Bishop's realtor brother-in-law had already agreed to handle the lease termination, ensuring Cora wouldn't have to sign a single form or answer a single call from the landlord. For the first time since the morning of March 6th, Cora felt the crushing weight of logistical panic lift from her chest. She was allowed to just breathe. She was allowed to just hold her son. On April 15th, they made the 2-hour drive south down Interstate 95, crossing the state line into Georgia as the late afternoon sun filtered through the massive moss-draped live oaks of Savannah. They turned into Ardsley Park, a neighborhood of quiet, tree-lined streets and historic bungalows. Beverly's home was a charming 1-story bungalow she and Fitz had bought together in 1988. It had a wide front porch with a green-painted swing, and the air around the yard smelled of blooming jasmine and damp earth. Inside, Beverly had prepared everything. She had turned Ethan's childhood bedroom into a sanctuary for Cora, leaving his old track trophies and high school photos on the shelves, a comforting reminder of the boy he had been before he became the man who saved lives. The adjacent guest room had been transformed into a nursery, complete with a beautifully restored, second-hand wooden rocking chair Beverly had bought from a neighbor down the street. That first morning, as the steam rose from bowls of fresh grits and scrambled eggs on the kitchen table, Beverly set a mug of coffee in front of Cora and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to talk today, honey," Beverly said softly, her eyes holding an ocean of shared grief and understanding. "Or tomorrow, or the day after that. You just rest. When you're ready, we'll talk." During those first quiet weeks, Cora slept in Ethan's old bed, wrapping herself in the silence of the house. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when she woke to feed the baby, she swore she could hear Ethan's laughter in the walls, a soft, protective echo telling her she was finally safe. Every Saturday, the low, steady rumble of a black F-150 would echo down the quiet street of Ardsley Park, pulling to a stop right in front of Beverly's bungalow. Bishop Howard would climb out, his heavy boots stepping onto the pavement, carrying a fresh, warm box of glazed donuts in one hand and a newspaper in the other. He would walk up the porch steps, take off his hat, and sit on the green-painted swing, his presence a comforting, unshakable anchor in their weekly routine. He would spend hours holding little Bishop Jr. on his lap, the massive, calloused hands that had held fire hoses for 30 years, cradling the tiny boy with an impossible gentleness. On those quiet afternoons, as the swing creaked softly back and forth, Bishop would tell Cora stories about Ethan that she had never heard. When Ethan was 6 years old, he snuck into Station 9 and hid in the back of the engine cab, Bishop said one afternoon, his eyes crinkling with a fond, distant memory. Fitz knew he was in there the whole time, but he went ahead and pretended to look for him for 45 minutes, just to see the look of pure triumph on the boy's face when he finally found him. He was a stubborn kid, Cora, but he had a heart that didn't know how to walk away from someone in need. He told her about how Fitz's Academy class of 1993 used to call Bishop Halo because he was far too clean-mouthed for a firehouse. He told her about how he had only cried twice in his entire adult life, first at Fitz's funeral and then at Ethan's. "But I'm telling you right now, Cora Belle," Bishop said, his voice cracking slightly as he looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. "The third time is going to be on this boy's first day of kindergarten, and I am going to try my absolute level best to hold it in." During one of those warm Saturday afternoons, little Bishop Jr. suddenly reached out his tiny, perfect hand and wrapped his fingers tightly around Bishop's thumb. He wouldn't let go. Bishop went completely quiet, his gaze fixed on the tiny fist, his shoulders shaking slightly as he swallowed back an overwhelming wave of emotion. Sensing the sacredness of the moment, Cora quietly stood up, stepped off the porch, and went inside to give him the space to weep in peace. She had not lost her family the day the world burned down. She had simply found the one that had been waiting for her all along. By the last week of March, the FBI had officially opened an active investigation into Douglas Lockridge. On a warm afternoon in late April, 2 special agents arrived at Beverly's bungalow. They wore crisp navy suits, their badges catching the southern sunlight. One of them was a woman near Cora's own age, named Special Agent Hall. They sat around Beverly's kitchen table, drinking glasses of sweet iced tea that Beverly had prepared, and asked Cora questions for 2 hours. Beverly stayed in the nursery with the baby, keeping him quiet and happy, while Bishop sat quietly in the living room, a protective, silent guardian in case Cora needed a break. "You are a witness in this case, Mrs. Whitfield, not a target," Agent Hall explained gently, her voice carrying a professional but deeply empathetic tone. "The forged signature, the timeline, the forwarded emails, and the voice memo Ethan left on his phone will form the absolute core of our prosecution. The U.S. Attorney's Office is moving forward with charges of wire fraud, making false statements to a federal agency, and the attempted theft of government benefits. The top count carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. You do not have to carry any specific anger for this prosecution, Cora. You only have to tell the truth when you are called to do so." "I understand," Cora said, her voice entirely calm. When the agents left, Agent Hall handed Cora her business card. Cora walked over to the fireplace, opened the polished wooden box Bishop and Delilah had brought down from Charleston, and placed the card inside. She closed the lid and did not open it again. A few weeks later, Bishop called her from Charleston with an update. "The federal indictment is coming, Cora," he said softly. "Probably by midsummer. But because of the overwhelming physical and digital evidence we secured, you will likely never have to step foot into a courtroom to testify unless you absolutely want to." "I'll decide when the time comes, Uncle Bishop," Cora replied. "That's my girl," Bishop said. "That is the perfect answer." By July of 2026, the thick, heavy heat of a Georgia summer had settled over Ardsley Park, turning the massive oaks into giant emerald umbrellas that shaded the quiet streets. The sweet, heavy scent of blooming jasmine from the spring had faded, replaced by the earthy smell of afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in from the coast like clockwork. Inside the cool, air-conditioned comfort of Beverly's bungalow, life had found a gentle, healing rhythm. Little Bishop Jr., now 4 months old, was no longer the fragile 4-pound infant who had fought for breath in a hospital bassinet. He had grown remarkably soft and round, his cheeks filling out and his eyes sparkling with a bright, curious clarity. He had officially outgrown his first 3 sets of onesies, a milestone that Beverly celebrated by hanging each outgrown outfit on a clothesline in the backyard, letting the southern sun bless the physical proof of his survival. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Cora sat on the green-painted porch swing with a sleeping Bishop Jr. resting against her shoulder, a delivery truck pulled up to the curb. The driver walked up the steps and handed Cora a certified, heavy overnight envelope from the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina. Her fingers didn't tremble as she slipped her finger under the tab to tear it open. She pulled out the document inside. It was a formal press release and a copy of a multi-count federal grand jury indictment. The bold print at the top read, United States of America vs. Douglas Lockridge and Trenton Lockridge. Cora leaned her head back against the swing, looking out at the sun-dappled yard as she read the sterile legal language. The Department of Justice wasn't holding back. Her father and brother were being charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and making false statements to a federal agency. Because of the digital footprints left on the PSOB server and the forged signatures, the evidence was absolute. But it was the secondary section of the document that caught her eye. Marlene Lockridge had not been indicted. Instead, she had signed a formal cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. In exchange for immunity, she had turned over all her personal text messages, emails, and financial ledgers, detailing exactly how Douglas had planned to divert Ethan's survivor benefits to cover Trenton's compounding gambling debts. Marlene had chosen to save her own skin, leaving her husband and son to face the federal Leviathan alone. A soft step sounded on the wooden porch. Beverly walked out, holding 2 tall glasses of sweet iced tea. She set them down on the small wicker table, her eyes falling on the legal papers in Cora's lap. "Is it done?" Beverly asked gently. "It's starting," Cora replied, handing her the indictment. Beverly adjusted her reading glasses and scanned the pages. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply let out a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 3 generations of proud, hard-working people who had never looked to steal from another man's sacrifice. "They'll have to sell the Mount Pleasant house to pay the legal fees and the restitution," Beverly noted quietly, her gaze shifting to the sleeping baby. "And Trenton, well, the federal government doesn't offer probation for aggravated identity theft. He'll serve time." "I know," Cora said. "How do you feel, honey?" Beverly asked, placing her hand over Cora's free one. Cora looked down at her son. For months, she had waited for a wave of anger, or perhaps a lingering sense of familial grief, to wash over her. But looking at the paper, she felt only a profound, clean emptiness. The people who had walked into her hospital room and called her child a bastard were no longer her family. They were merely names on a court docket, miles away, drowning in a storm of their own making. "I feel light, Mom," Cora said, using the title for Beverly naturally for the first time. "I just feel light." Later that evening, Bishop Howard's black F-150 pulled up to the house. He didn't bring donuts this time. Instead, he carried a large, cardboard moving box under one arm. He walked into the living room, setting the box down on the rug. "What's this, Uncle Bishop?" Cora asked, walking in from the kitchen. "The department finalizes the administrative closeouts on personal property after 90 days, Bishop said, his voice carrying its usual warm, low rumble. "This is the rest of Ethan's locker gear from Station 9. His turnout coat, his helmet, and his personal logbooks. I wanted to bring them down myself." Cora knelt by the box. Slowly, she opened the cardboard flaps. The faint, unmistakable scent of cedar, worn leather, and a hint of charcoal drifted up into the room. Sitting right on top was Ethan's heavy yellow fire helmet, its front leather shield slightly charred, but displaying the proud, bold number 9. She picked up the helmet, her fingers tracing the rough, soot-stained edges. "The guys at the station polished the shield for you," Bishop said softly, standing by the window with his hands tucked into his pockets. "They wanted to make sure it was clean for the boy when he's old enough to hold it." Cora smiled, a single warm tear escaping her eye and landing on the scuffed yellow brim. "It's perfect. Thank you, Bishop." Underneath the helmet lay Ethan's leather-bound daily logbook. She opened it to the very last page, dated March 5, 2026, the night before the warehouse fire. Written in Ethan's messy, hurried print were just a few lines. "D-shift quiet. Cleaned the rig. Called Corabelle at 8 o'clock. She says the baby is kicking like a kicker. I think he's going to be a runner. Can't wait to get home to my family." Cora closed the book, holding it tightly against her chest. Her parents had believed that the Whitfield name was nothing but bad luck. But as she stood in the warm Savannah living room, surrounded by the people who had shielded her, loved her, and fought for her, she knew the truth. She had married into a legacy of courage, honor, and a love so fierce it had reached out from beyond the grave to save her and her son. And no forged signature or broken family could ever take that away. 6 months after the federal indictments were handed down, the quiet streets of Ardsley Park had cooled under the crisp, golden canopy of late autumn. The heavy summer humidity had vanished, replaced by a sharp coastal breeze that rustled the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient live oaks. Inside the cozy bungalow, little Bishop Jr. was now a thriving, active 9-month-old, crawling with a determined speed that kept both Cora and Beverly on their toes. He had found his voice, filling the house with loud, happy babbles that constantly made Beverly laugh. Cora sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee between her hands, looking over the final legal correspondence from Special Agent Hall. The legal storm in Charleston had finally reached its conclusion. Douglas Lockridge, facing overwhelming digital evidence and the devastating testimony of his own wife, had pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Rather than face a public trial that would completely dissect what was left of his reputation, he had accepted a plea deal. At 61 years old, he had been sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional institution. Trenton, whose compounding gambling debts had catalyzed the entire desperate scheme, had received 5 years. Because of his cooperation and lack of prior criminal history, the court had recommended a low-security facility, but the reality of his sentence was absolute. The Mount Pleasant house, the shining crown jewel of Douglas's social standing, had been sold to satisfy the federal restitution requirements and outstanding debts. Marlene, living in a modest rental apartment in West Ashley, paid for by what remained of her own separate family assets, was completely isolated. She had saved herself from prison, but in doing so, she had alienated the only people who had ever truly stood by her. Cora folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. For the first time in nearly a year, she felt no anger, no satisfaction, and no lingering bitterness. They were simply strangers who had chosen a path of greed, while she had chosen a path of life. "A penny for your thoughts, sweetheart," Beverly said, walking into the kitchen and lifting a giggling Bishop Jr. into her arms. "I was just thinking about how quiet everything is now," Cora said, smiling as her son reached his chubby arms out toward her. She took him from Beverly, pressing a warm kiss to his soft forehead. "The lawyers are done. The court is done. It's just us." "And that is exactly how it should be," Beverly said, her eyes shining with pride. "You've built a beautiful piece here, Cora. Your father-in-law, Fitz, used to say that the strongest structures aren't the ones that never catch fire, but the ones built with materials that can survive the heat. You and this boy are made of the good stuff." That Saturday, The familiar black F-150 rumbled down the street, pulling up to the curb right on time. Bishop Howard climbed out, but he wasn't wearing his usual work blues or his formal Class A uniform. He wore a comfortable flannel shirt and jeans, his face relaxed in a way Cora hadn't seen since before the tragedy. He walked up the steps, carrying a small, beautifully framed photograph. "I found this in the old station archives this week," Bishop said, handing the frame to Cora as he stepped onto the porch. Cora looked down at the photo. It was a candid, sunlit shot of a young Fitz Whitfield and a teenage Bishop Howard standing in front of Engine 9, their turnouts covered in soot, their arms slung over each other's shoulders as they laughed at something off camera. But standing right between them, wearing a fire helmet that was entirely too big for his head and holding a plastic fire nozzle, was an 8-year-old Ethan, his smile wide and absolutely fearless. "He wanted to be just like us," Bishop said softly, his voice thick with a warm, nostalgic affection. "But the truth is, he became better than both of us." Cora ran her thumb over the glass of the frame, her eyes wet but her heart entirely light. "He did," she whispered. She carried the frame inside and placed it gently on the mantel, right next to the polished wooden box containing Ethan's keepsake logbooks and his service badge. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the front yard, Cora sat on the green-painted porch swing, rocking her sleeping son against her chest. Beside her, Beverly and Bishop chatted quietly, their voices a familiar, comforting murmur that felt as natural as the coastal wind. Cora looked down at Bishop Jr., his chest rising and falling in a deep, perfect, and steady rhythm. He was safe. He was loved. He was surrounded by a family of choice, a family of honor, and a legacy that could never be stolen. She closed her eyes and let the swing rock her forward, finally at peace, knowing that the fire had ended and the healing had finally completely begun. The first anniversary of the night, Ethan went into the warehouse, arrived not with a sudden storm, but with a quiet, golden autumn morning that smelled of salt air and decaying sweet gum leaves. Cora woke up early, before the sun had even cleared the roof lines of Ardsley Park. Beside her in the crib, Bishop Jr., now a sturdy 19-month-old, with a head full of wild, dark curls, lay sprawled on his stomach, snoring softly. He had spent the last week masterfully learning how to run rather than crawl, a development that had forced Beverly to rapidly raise the latches on every cabinet in the kitchen. Cora slipped out of bed, threw on a heavy knit cardigan, and walked out to the kitchen. To her surprise, Beverly was already awake, sitting at the small wooden table in the dim light. She didn't have her usual cup of coffee. Instead, she had the polished wooden keepsake box open in front of her. Resting beside it was Ethan's old leather-bound daily logbook. "I didn't mean to wake you, honey," Beverly said softly, looking up with a gentle, watery smile. "You didn't," Cora replied, stepping over to press her forehead against Beverly's shoulder. "What are you looking at?" Beverly ran her fingers over the scuffed leather cover. "Just remembering the day he bought this. He was so proud of himself. He came home from his first shift at Station 9 and said, 'Mom, I'm a record keeper now. I've got to write down every run, just like Dad did.' He kept to it too, even on the nights they didn't get a single call." Cora pulled out a chair and sat down next to her. She reached into the box and pulled out the small framed photo Bishop Howard had brought them months ago, the one of young Fitz, teenage Bishop, and a tiny, fearless Ethan holding a plastic fire nozzle. "We should go see him today," Cora said quietly. Beverly nodded, squeezing Cora's hand. "Yes, we should." By mid-afternoon, the black F-150 was parked at the curb of the Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. Bishop Howard had driven them up from Savannah himself, his quiet presence at the wheel acting as the same protective shield he had been for the last year and a half. The air was cool and crisp as they walked down the gravel path, the dry oak leaves crunching beneath their shoes. Bishop carried Bishop Jr. on his hip, the toddler staring in fascination at the gold buttons on Bishop's working uniform. Ethan's resting place lay beneath the spreading branches of a massive live oak, the gray Spanish moss swaying gently in the breeze. The headstone was simple, carved from gray granite, bearing his name, his dates, and the insignia of the Charleston Fire Department. Cora stepped forward and knelt on the damp grass. She reached out, her fingers tracing the deeply carved letters of her husband's name. "We brought your boy, Ethan," she whispered, her voice steady and full of a deep, resonant peace. "He's running now, just like you said he would." Behind her, Bishop Howard set the toddler down on the grass. Little Bishop Jr. didn't run away. Instead, he took a few hesitant, wide-legged steps toward his mother, his eyes locking onto the bright, polished brass firefighter's coin that Bishop Howard had placed at the base of the headstone earlier. He reached out his tiny hand, his fingers brushing the cool metal. "Stubborn chin and all," Beverly murmured, wiping a single quiet tear from her cheek as she stepped up to stand beside Cora. "He's got his father's heart, Cora. I see it more every day." They stood there for a long time, the four of them, a family forged not by blood or legal documents, but by sacrifice, honor, and an unyielding, protective love. The shadows of the live oak grew long and thin across the grass, but the chill of the graveyard didn't touch them. They carried their own warmth. As they finally turned to walk back to the truck, Cora looked back one last time. The sun was setting over the marshes in the distance, casting a brilliant amber glow across the granite headstone. She took her son's hand in her right and Beverly's in her left. With Bishop Howard leading the way, his broad shoulders squaring against the evening breeze, Cora walked forward into the light of the life they had built together, finally, completely free. The summer of 2031 arrived in Savannah like a slow, golden wave, heavy with the scent of saltwater marshes and sweet wild oleander. In the quiet, sun-dappled yard of the Ardsley Park bungalow, the old green-painted porch swing swayed gently in the morning breeze. 5 years had passed since the night the world had fractured, but on this particular August morning, the house was alive with a nervous, electric energy. Inside, 5-year-old Bishop Jr. was standing on a kitchen chair, proudly admiring his reflection in the dark glass of the microwave. He was wearing a brand-new, slightly oversized blue backpack decorated with tiny yellow fire engines, and his wild dark curls had been brushed down with water, though a stubborn cowlick at the crown of his head refused to cooperate. "Do I look like a big kid, Mama?" he asked, turning his bright, intensely curious eyes toward Cora. Cora, dressed in her pediatric nursing scrubs, felt a familiar, swelling warmth in her chest. She stepped forward, reaching up to adjust the straps of his backpack. "The biggest sweet pea. You look exactly like a boy ready for his very first day of kindergarten." "And what about the shoes?" Beverly asked, walking in from the stove with a plate of warm blueberry pancakes. At 72, Beverly's stride was as steady as ever, her face lined with the beautiful, soft creases of a grandmother who had spent the last 5 years laughing far more than she had wept. "A firefighter's boy needs fast shoes, BJ." Bishop Jr. stomped his light-up sneakers against the linoleum, watching the heels flash a bright, vibrant red. "Super fast, Nana." Right on cue, the low, unmistakable rumble of a black F-150 echoed down the street, pulling to a stop directly in front of the bungalow. Cora walked to the front door, leaning against the screen as she watched Bishop Howard climb out of the driver's seat. He wasn't in his Class A uniform, nor his work blues. He had officially retired from the Charleston Fire Department 6 months earlier, handing the reins of Station 9 over to a new generation. Today he wore a simple linen shirt and khaki trousers. But as he walked up the porch steps, Cora noticed he was uncharacteristically quiet. He was carrying a small brown paper bag, and his eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, were already swimming with a glassy, emotional moisture. "Uncle Bishop!" the boy squealed, bursting through the screen door and launching himself down the steps. Bishop caught him effortlessly, swinging the boy up into his massive, calloused arms and squeezing him tightly against his chest. "Look at you," Bishop murmured, his voice thick and raspy. "Look at how big you got overnight. I swear you were only up to my knee yesterday." He set the boy down on the porch railing, keeping a protective hand on his back. Bishop reached into the paper bag and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a brand-new, miniature leather shield, custom-made to match the one on Ethan's old yellow helmet. Embossed on the leather in gold leaf was the number 9, and underneath it, the initials BW Jr. "I talked to the guys back at the station," Bishop said, his jaw working as he tried to swallow back the lump in his throat. "They wanted you to have a piece of the engine with you today. You clip this to your backpack zipper, and you'll always have a whole department of uncles riding shotgun." Bishop Jr.'s eyes went wide. "Like Daddy?" "Exactly like your daddy," Bishop whispered. He leaned his forehead against the boy's curls, and just as he had promised on this very porch years ago, the tough, legendary battalion chief finally lost the battle. A single heavy tear escaped his eye, rolling down his weathered cheek. Cora stepped onto the porch, sliding her arm around Bishop's waist. He looked down at her, offering a wet, self-deprecating laugh. "I told you, Cora Belle," he muttered, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I told you I'd try to hold it in." "You did your best, Uncle Bishop," Cora said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You did your best." The drive to the elementary school was short, filled with the excited chatter of a 5-year-old explaining exactly how fast his new sneakers could run on the playground. As they walked up the concrete path toward the bright, welcoming entrance of Ardsley Park Elementary, Cora felt a profound, echoing sense of closure. The legal battles, the federal courtrooms, and the cold, transactional greed of the Lockridge family had long since faded into a distant, quiet background. Douglas and Trenton were still serving their time, completely removed from the life she had built. Marlene's occasional, desperate attempts to send letters from her quiet apartment in West Ashley had been met with a firm, legal boundary. Cora didn't harbor any active malice toward them anymore. They had simply become strangers in a story she had finished reading. At the classroom door, Bishop Jr. stopped. He looked at his teacher, then back at the small group standing in the hallway, his mother, his Nana, and his Uncle Bishop. He didn't cry. He didn't cling to Cora's scrubs. Instead, he reached down and patted the small leather 9 swinging from his backpack. "I'll be back at 3, Mama," he said with all the serious, stubborn determination of a Whitfield. "Make sure the truck is parked in the front." "We'll be right here, baby," Cora whispered, kneeling to press one last, lingering kiss to his cheek. "We'll always be right here." They watched him walk through the door, his little flashing shoes lighting up with every brave step he took into his own future. He sat down at a small table, turned back, and gave them a cheerful, energetic wave before burying his nose in a coloring book. As the 3 of them turned and walked back out into the warm, bright Georgia sunshine, Cora looked up at the blue sky, letting the warm wind brush against her face. She had lost a husband, and she had lost the family she was born into. But as she walked down the steps flanked by Beverly and Bishop, her hands securely held in theirs, she knew she had won the only thing that ever truly mattered. She had found her home, and the foundation they had built together was entirely, beautifully unbreakable.